All right, so to kind of connect what I'm doing here with the sort of key terms that were introduced in the first week of class, I want to point out one of the things we're doing here is that Prospero's relationship to Caliban and Ariel may be a metaphor for the relationship between slave owners and slaves. That's interesting. The other thing I want to point out is one of the things we're going to be doing here is sort of an advanced form of summary. Now, obviously, summary is this happened and this happened and this happened and this happened and this happened. But what's going to happen here is Prospero is going to talk about the prehistory of the island before he got there. Prospero learns about what the island was like before Prospero arrived. And so by listening to Prospero lecture Ariel about, because we didn't actually see Prospero get Ariel out of the tree, but he's going to summarize it for us. And by listening to Prospero talk, you can kind of learn about what happened on the island. All those years ago. Prospero's been on the island for 12 years. So you get to kind of learn the prehistory of the island. And if you learn that story, there's interesting things going on there that connect directly to the events of the Tempest. So it's not just like a rando history lesson about the island. It's really a lesson about, it's really a metaphor for the things going on the island. So let's take a look at what Prospero says to Ariel about what happened those years ago. So Prospero says, dost thou forget from what a torment I did free thee? No, thou dost, and think it does much to tread the ooze of the salt deep, to run upon the sharp winds of the north. You forget that I freed you. Otherwise, you wouldn't be bitching and moaning about doing all these things, like running to the sharp wind of the north and doing business with the veins of the earth. Veins of the earth is lava. I do not, sir. Thou liest, malignant thing. So he says, you're lying. You did forget, otherwise you wouldn't be complaining. Hast thou forgot the foul witch Sycorax, who with age and envy was grown into a hoop? Hast thou forgot her? No, sir, thou hast. Where was she born? Speak, tell me. Sir, in Argier. So there was a witch named Sycorax. Now, Sycorax is not a character in the play. There is a witch in this play. She's not in the play, but she's in the back history of Ireland. She's dead before Prospero got to the island. But we get to learn about this witch named Sycorax that used to be on the island. So he says, interestingly, the witch was in Argier, which is in Africa. And was she so? I must once a month recount what thou hast been, which thou forget. So he says, Ariel, you're very forgetful. You forget where you came from. I have to always remind you. This damned witch Sycorax, for mischiefs manifold and sorceries terrible to enter human hearing, from Argier, thou knowest, was banished. Now, for starters, he says, in the old days, there was a witch who was banished here because she's magic. She had magical powers, and so she got kicked out of her country, and she ended up on this island. The first thing to notice is that's exactly what happened to Prospero. He also learned magical powers. He also got banished from his home city. He also crash landed on this island. So just for starters, we have an idea that there may be a metaphor connecting what happened to Sycorax with what happened to Prospero. The fact that Sycorax is evil, maybe a hint that Prospero is also evil, but let's keep going. And of course, owning slaves is not great. So let's see what else we have to learn from this. For one thing she did, they would not take her life. Is this not true? Aye, sir. This blue-eyed hag was hither brought with child, and here was left by the sailors. So this is a thing that happened in courts of law back in the old days, was if you did something wrong, they would execute you. But if you were pregnant, they wouldn't execute you because they don't want to kill the kid. So she would have been killed for doing evil magic in her own country, but because she was pregnant, they kicked her out and banished her to this island. So there's another connection between Prospero and the witch, which is that Prospero learned magic, banished from his people, ended up on this island. Sycorax learned magic, banished from her people, ended up on this island. But also, Prospero came with his daughter Miranda. Sycorax went to the island pregnant. So another connection between the two characters is that both Sycorax and Prospero have children. Let's keep going. Thou, my slave, and there's the word right there. He calls Ariel his slave. Thou, my slave, as thou reports thyself, was then her servant. So Ariel used to be the servant to Sycorax. And for thou wast a spirit too delicate to act her earthly and abhorred commands, refusing her grand hests, she did confine thee, by help of her most potent ministers, and in her most unmitigable rage, into a cloven pine, within which rift imprisoned thou didst painfully remain a dozen years. So Ariel used to be Sycorax's servant, but Sycorax wanted Ariel to do bad shit. We don't know what, but bad things. And Ariel refused, and so to punish him, Sycorax stuck Ariel in a tree. And then she died. And so Ariel was like permanently stuck in that tree. And then Prospero arrives on the island and he frees Ariel, which seems really nice, except he says, hey, since I freed you, you're my fucking slave now. And I'll let you go later, but you gotta work for me in the meantime. Okay. Within which space she died, and left thee there, where thou didst vent thy groans as fast as mill wheels strike. Then was this island, save for the son that she did litter here, a freckled whelp hag-born, not honoured with a human shape. So in that time, there were no people there except for Sycorax's kid, Caliban. So this is a whole fascinating thing. But her child, Sycorax's child, is Caliban. So I don't know, by the way, who Sycorax had sex with in order to have this kind of mutant child. The suggestion here, Prospero will say later, is that witches were thought to kind of have sex with Satan. And so Caliban may be some kind of devil child. One of the most interesting things I want to point out in this play, though, is Prospero, who you imagine is sort of like a white guy. Prospero shows up on this island and he runs the island. But he's not from the island, right? The island's not his home. He's kind of an invader. Sycorax, it's also not her home, right? She's from Algiers, so she's also kind of an invader. Caliban, though, is interesting because she was pregnant with Caliban when she arrived on the island, and Caliban was born on the island, which means Caliban is the only character in The Tempest who was born on the island. So in some sense, Caliban is the only sort of natural citizen of the island. In some ways, it's Caliban's island. He's the only creature that was born there. And one way of thinking about Prospero is this white guy and his white daughter are invaders to an island. Now, again, there's not a lot of people on the island, but do you see do you see a metaphor building here, where Prospero shows up on an island and enslaves the people on the island? Does that sound a little bit like Christopher Columbus showing up in America and enslaving Native Americans? It should remind you of sort of the history of slavery, of people kind of showing up to a country that is not theirs and then controlling the native people. Caliban, that's why it's interesting that in the movie version, Caliban is played by a black actor. Now, Shakespeare doesn't say exactly what Caliban looks like. It's kind of confusing. Shakespeare sometimes makes Caliban seem like part fish, or maybe caveman. I don't know, like a puppy. At one point, they describe him looking like a dog. But Caliban is born on the island. But the slavery metaphor, when you cast a black actor as Caliban, it's like you're telling the audience, you're pointing them to the metaphor. Because black people's history in the United States of America was as slaves, is sort of the backstory to most black Americans. Have a history of their family was enslaved, and so when you put a black actor into The Tempest, it kind of helps the audience to see this metaphor, because it's obviously, if Prospero has a slave, it's not hard to see it's a metaphor for slavery. But if the slave is black, and if the slave was born there when Prospero wasn't, it starts to feel like Native Americans, for example. And so I just want to point out that it's casting. The actor that you have play the role can help do things with the metaphor. Okay, cool. All right, next video.